The subject of this week is globalization, and this is a pretty obvious segue or reference to something that we have seen before in this class from Marshall McLuhan telling us about the global village of electronic media. And in its context, of course, the idea of a global village has to do with the most pressing concern of its time, which is the difference that is happening between the United States and the USSR in the heart of the Cold War. And Marshall McLuhan tells us that Soviet concern with media results is natural to any oral society where interdependence is the result of instant interplay of cause and effect in the total structure. Such is the character of a village, or since electric or electronic media, such is also the character of a global village. And it is the advertising and PR community that is most aware of this basic new dimension of global interdependence. Like the Soviet Union, they are concerned about access to the media and about results. They have no concern whatever about self-expression and would be shocked by any attempt to take over, say, a public advertisement for oil or coke as a vehicle of private opinion or personal feeling. In the same way, the literate bureaucrats of the Soviet Union cannot imagine anybody wanting to use public media in a private way. And this attitude has just nothing to do with Marx, Lenin, or communism. It is a normal tribal attitude of any oral society. The Soviet press is their equivalent of our Madison Avenue in shaping production and social processes. And of course, the most important idea that we have mentioned so far is this global village. And it ties to our idea of globalization because, in Marshall McLuhan's view, and in the way that many people tend to present the idea of globalization, we are going towards this global village. To a certain extent, it is true that we now have ways to communicate across the world at an almost instant rate. As McLuhan is telling us here, there is this possibility of a instant interplay of cause and effect in the total structure of the world. And in the context of advertising, of course, this is a pretty valuable way in which you can have feedback about the things you are advertising, as is pointed out here. But as McLuhan is pointing out, this is something that exists as well in the USSR. And what he mentions that the Soviet press is the equivalent of our Madison Avenue. This is just the understanding that within the Soviet press, at least as far as Stalin saw it, the state was promoting the interest of the state, and the state was promoting the interest of whatever was valuable to the people through the production that is allowed by the state. In the United States, a similar thing would happen through the private opinion, although, as he points out here, there is this weird antagonism, a public advertisement for oil or coke as a vehicle of private opinion or personal feeling would be something that is shocking. And certainly for us today, the fact of life that advertising is pretty much in everything we do is somewhat inescapable. That anytime you visit a website for anything, you will have advertisement for something else more or less distantly related. And this happens in every app as well. But also, what is interesting for our context is that Marshall McLuhan points that not as as a measure of a state organization or even an ideology, but as a measure of a tribal organization, as he points out here. Now, this is interesting in two very different ways. The number one most interesting, I think, I would say, is the idea that globalization today is somewhat seen as a fact of life, although it is also something that is controversial for political purposes, I guess. But that's not going to be much of our concern here. The better concern is that this idea of globalization has never been quite theorized in any place. In other words, you cannot find a definition of globalization anywhere, as opposed to just thinking of it as this broad interplay of cause and effect in the total structure of the world, essentially, as McLuhan points it, even though he's writing this before the modern conversations of economics and globalization. The secondary aspect, of course, has to do with the tribe, which is something that is a very anthropological concern for us. And as far as the internet is concerned, the tribe is also an ancient concept for the ideas of the web. And this is from the website tribe.net, founded in the early 2000s, which was a way to connect different people, especially as you can see here from San Francisco. This is kind of relating us to those ideas of the West Coast and Silicon Valley as the heart of the internet revolution and the ways in which those tech communities started to organize very early on the West Coast as opposed to the East Coast. And very quickly, this website, tribe.net, became very popular around California, but it didn't really grow much outside of that. There's a couple of reasons for it. Number one was the fact that this is very early in the internet, and having a lot of users at a time on a website at a time was a very resource intensive process, not necessarily something that websites could handle, and the website was not very stable. There was also a very different infrastructure for the internet itself. So having again, as to use McLuhan's word, this instant relationship through that website was not quite the way it is today. Another kind of turning point for tribe.net was the fact that in 2005 they had to block any kind of pornographic content, mostly because California adopted a law that was that prevented the circulation of pornographic images on the internet, especially those that display children. And the easiest way for the website to block this was to avoid any kind of sexual content, whatever, which made a lot of people unhappy at the time. And of course, this is partly due to I don't know, I guess you could say edgy crowd that was frequented the site, as also by the fact that it was still seen at the time as a very repressive move from the time on the internet where pretty much anything and everything was allowable. But this idea of tribe has grown quite a bit over the course of the years, and very quickly it became a mainstay of describing the kinds of attitudes that you find on the internet. For example, here in this article in The Guardian, that we'll get back to in a minute, focusing on the emergence of digital tribes. People often lament that the advance of technology has had a dehumanizing effect, but the reality is quite the opposite. The second digital decade is all about personalization and connectivity in ways that previously were not possible or imaginable. Far from inhabiting expression, technology has enhanced and enabled our individuality. For example, websites such as the BBC allow us to tailor the homepage so that it contains only those categories that are of personal interest, while social network sites such as Facebook and MySpace provide a canvas for self-expression and a harbor for community. People are no longer constrained and isolated by physical boundaries. Instead, they can connect in a very personal and tailored way with hundreds of people with similar interests across the world, forming quote unquote digital tribes that hold common interests and beliefs. So that this kind of discourse is not something that is new to our class. This is a lot of the conversations that we have had so far, but this is the first time that we are encountering it focused on this idea of a tribe. Now, tribe, kind of like globalization, is another term that we have imported through our past and never quite bothered to define. There's no good way to define a tribe. This is something that we have inherited from antiquity, where there was a description of tribes in the Roman era, including the Romans themselves describing tribes of Roman people. It was not necessarily associated with a pre-modern or even a modern form of organization. This was seen as a way, like it said here, of people that hold common interests and beliefs. Although pretty quickly that conversation became a lot more widely applied to groups of people who share beliefs and perhaps practices and perhaps another kind of thing, but often seen as a exotic other, if you will, as a conversation of people that have those weird beliefs, those weird practices, and sometimes their weird language, as we're going to see in a second. This particular article here from The Guardian, another one, but a different year, 2011, tells us about Lady Gaga's rounding up the monsters. Rihanna got her fans joining the Navy. Meanwhile, Pixie Lott is all about the crazy cats. So this idea of Lady Gaga's tribe of followers, the monsters, Rihanna's tribe of followers that apparently don't get a name, Pixie Lott's followers of the Crazy Cats. I guess it was a bit too early to talk about Nicki Minaj's Barbies and Beyonce's Beehive, but the idea remains the same, that you have the possibility on the internet to share this group of people that has a specific name attached to it, and you might have a way to identify your people as being part of the Beehive, of the monsters, of whatever other group. And certainly, social media is allowing people to communicate within those groups, but also to share those symbols that they will have in common here with one another. Now, in the context of anthropology, this has to do with a form of evolution that we have since discarded quite a bit. The idea that people would grow from being these roaming bands of rubbing hordes of quote unquote primitive people to becoming organized tribes that would eventually grow into a state organization. This was seen, as we have mentioned before in this class, as a natural progression, although it is not the case. But you can only wonder how much people who are using this vocabulary of tribes here actually subscribe to this kind of idea. If we consider these tribes on the internet as a weird form of deviant practices, and especially using people like Lady Gaga, Rihanna, or Pixie Lott as examples, or if it has to do with a something more legitimate of an experience. And certainly it doesn't seem like those vocabulary of digital tribes is treating those groups of people as anything more than an odd practice for odd people. In other words, if this was a normal fandom, the way that there was Beatles mania in the 60s, would there be such a name for it and such an interest for it? And of course, Beatlemania was at the time seen as odd, and that eventually become a much more accepted form of behavior. In the same way that today, I'm sure groups of monsters and Beehive and Barbies and whatnot would be seen as a lot more common than they were in 2011. But the study of these so-called digital tribes has become a item in social sciences. For example, here, this article uh, from 2013, I guess. I can't really read my screen. 2013, an article of data science that points to language used in so-called Twitter tribes, or groups of people who are converging on Twitter and, again, instantly interplaying with each other. Language as functions that transcend the transmission of information and varies with social context. To find out how language and social network structure interlink or interplay, we have studied communication on Twitter, a broadly used online messaging service. RP to Twitter, of course. Now that we are 9 years down the line and we are talking about a different item, this is strangely in the news. It is kind of interesting to find that using algorithms, as this is the case that is happening here, this is a statistical study, you could recognize the way that specific groups are talking about certain subjects, and again, be characterized or maybe essentialized as this group or that group. That, in other words, if you had the right tools, you might be able to say that this person with a fair level of certainty belongs to this particular fandom, or that particular fandom, or is um, um, an adept of this particular form of culture or whatever. But it comes down to a larger conversation that was prefaced a couple of slides ago in that article the in the Guardian, the first one that I mentioned, showing those diverse nature of digital tribes are as follows. For example, network television, the website for the television series Lost, produced by the U.S. network ABC, is a good example of a digital tribe. Users of the show's website are passionate about the show and want the ability not only to access programming content, but also to converse with other members of the tribe regardless of location. Their principal loyalty is also likely to be the show itself rather than the network, writers, or actors. Facebook and MySpace, these social media services are the most obvious examples where tribes are formed around personal connection and content. The tribes are not formed around the websites per se, but are centered on the tribes of families and friends. And finally, Wikipedia. Wikipedia extracts numbers of several different tribes. There is a primary tribe of content contributors who will have similar characteristics, including demands around authority, ease of use, and technical functionality. This tribe can be broken down into subtribes of people who, given their efforts to actually contribute, are likely to feel passionate about the particular topic they comment on, whether it be coffee beans or Ford Mustangs. Then there are another set of tribes made up of people who access this content in this way. Wikipedia can serve thousands of tribes based on contributors and users who care about particular topics. And so this website or this article goes on to explain how those tribes can be looked at, informed of their loyalty in terms of their size, the number of people who are going to those websites, the kind of capital that they have amassed over the years, where people have more or less been monetized as groups of people. This is especially important for Wikipedia, and eventually the weird interplay between different groups where you can have a fandom of a specific group meeting with the fandom of another groups and having those kind of odd rivalries. Now, this is especially interesting as we are seeing these examples because the shows such as Lost and the website on ABC, Facebook, MySpace, or Wikipedia, those are websites that exist before the tribes themselves, and it kind of seems to break our idea of the tribe as a tribe that self-identifies as such, or a tribe that can be seen as organized around a group or interest, because the interest here was created before the tribe. The show existed before it had fans. The Facebook and MySpace existed before people were users on those sites, and Wikipedia as an encyclopedia also existed before there was an interest for online an online encyclopedia such as this one, even though there were digital encyclopedias that existed at the time. Now, this is probably interesting in the context of this particular article, which is written by Tudor Ah at kpmg.co.uk. Tudor is a partner at KPMG's London office, is a technology sector head for KPMG UK, 25-year experience working in device and technology, media, telecom industry, blah, blah, blah. In other words, this is from an advertising agency. And of course, in the context of an advertising industry, those tribes are an important focus. This is what McLuhan was telling us 50 years ago, and or 70 years ago. Geez, a while ago. And not much has changed in that context. And it is very clear that from the point of view of advertising, the creation of these tribes is something that is very valuable because that is the way that they can do their job, that they can advertise and peddle their wares to all kinds of unsuspecting people. Organizing them as tribes still remains that weirdly condescending function of how you can think of them. Speaking of weirdly condescending, a little bit of technology that exists here from pager brands in France, two of which were called Temtem and Tattoo. Temtem, of course, like the African drum, Tattoo, like the vaguely marginal form of body modification. And of course, these things serve as a form of tribal identification in the Pacific Islands in Africa, but the vocabulary was borrowed to create pagers that would allow people to keep in touch with their literal tribe. And this was, in fact, um, their motto for a while. It says there, keep contact with your tribe. And this is advertised by the French government, by the way, because there was a monopoly on French telecommunications at the time. So so here we are, in fact, kind of quite literally talking about tribes, or at least talking about the anthropological context of tribes being kept together using pagers in the 90s. And certainly it is a full circle, or in the context of the previous slide, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that people who seek to keep people together have used tools that are keeping people together for the purpose of keeping people together, and therefore not much of a particular news to anyone. Example here from Evans Pritchard from his kind of seminal look at the Nuer group of people living in South Sudan and northern Ethiopia. The largest political segment among the Nuer is the tribe. There is no larger group who, besides recognizing themselves as a distinct local community affirm their obligation to combine in warfare against outsiders and acknowledge the rights of their members to compensation for injury. And in that case here, using the ways to organize themselves as tribes is a way to organize their common interests around those ideas of shared belief, shared practices, but it is 100% a matter of self-identification, not a pre-existing knowledge of the world, not a pre-existing need for a state or a community to stand together, but rather a way that people have kind of organically, if you will, organized for as long as we can remember. The internet and the tribes of the global village here seem to go kind of counter to the idea of a global tribe because it doesn't seem like everyone would be constantly interplaying with each other, especially if we break it down into those different interest groups, those different TV shows, those different artists and whatever. Those are not all communicating all at the same time, and therefore we do not have much of a global village, but more of a potential for global villages that are probably maybe at some point going to come up together if it works out for them.